Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see you all here around. So we will have now our third session in this social analysis of penalty across boundaries workshop series. In this opportunity, we will have a presentation by Professor David Santos Fonseca from the Federal University of Sul da Bahia in Brazil. And he will present a paper titled Between Penal Minimalism and Punitive Authoritarianism, Brazilian Imprisonment Policies and the Dynamics of Subnational Variation. Thank you very much, David, for being here with us. It's a great pleasure to have you here in this workshop series. So you will have 30 minutes or so to give your presentation, and then we'll have a discussion with all the participants.
That's perfect. Okay, thank you, Máximo. I'm going to share my screen here. Just a sec. There you go. So, first of all, great pleasure to be here. It's always very good to be among friendly faces, people that I know, and some new acquaintances as well. And we have been discussing about what I'm planning to talk about today with you for some time now, and even in some sessions in the past with Máximo. So it's a way of enlarging the audience in this topic and keep the conversation going. So once again, many thanks to all of you who are attending. And today we are going to be talking about the situation in Brazil. And we are going to be talking about what's happening in the country, which is a topic of concern for Brazilians for obvious reasons, but it seems to be some heated topic internationally as well. And this work that I have here today, it's an update of an earlier work in which I have been working for quite some time, and in which I analyze the Brazilian criminal and penal policies over the last 2 centuries, basically since its independence. And in this earlier work, the final moment of analysis was 2014, still within the first government of Dilma Rousseff before she was overthrown from power. And it's an attempt to actually see what's happening, what's taking place here over the last years since the coup d'etat, since we had the overthrow and since this new president came into power. And the logics here is basically trying to see how the dynamics of an approach dedicated to human rights conflicts with another take on politics, but on penal policies, crime control policies, that's an authoritarian one. And the authoritarian one is the one which has the upper hand right now. So it is the one that is basically in the presidential office, but also, and that's the second point that I want to discuss, that's the subnational variation within Brazil. In many states, this more robust or this tougher approach has also to win the last elections. So we have a lot of governors around the country who share the same perspective as the president. So as I'm saying, and mostly for an international audience, what I try to do is obviously situate Brazil in a larger context. So have a few moments to address this long history of Brazilian criminal policies, what was taking place mostly after the democracy returned to the country in the 80s, and then discuss some aspects, some contemporary aspects. So we begin with the Brazilian crime complex. We move to the traditional narratives of punitiveness and penal populism, which is somehow as well a dialogue that I have with Máximo. Then understand a little bit the state dynamics in the federation arrangement here in Brazil, and briefly go through governance periods since 2007 and this clash between these two different approaches. So the crime complex in Brazil is characterized by mass incarceration, something that took place in Brazil mostly in the first decade of this century, and high rates of homicide. We take homicide as a proxy, obviously, for the levels of criminality in the country, as it's usual elsewhere as well, as we cannot rely on crime statistics, and victimization surveys in Brazil are not so common. The homicides, the number of murders, they might actually present for us some indication of the levels of interpersonal violence. And as you can see, it's extremely high. Back in the 70s, when we first had this series in 1979, and throughout the 80s, we can see a steep increase in homicide numbers. In 79, the numbers of Brazil were pretty much comparable to what we had at that time in the US. Not low, but not this spike, not reaching 60,000 as we did in 2017. So we have also, and it's one of the problems that we are facing right now, decrease in the number of homicides. It seems to be a good sign, but mostly it's at least partially related with fiddling with the numbers by the government. So a number of deaths have been characterized as intentionality not defined. So in that instance, we do have numbers of people that are getting killed, but somehow they are not getting into the statistics. There might be a drop, but not as significant as this one here. And in terms of the prison population on the left here, we can see that the increase took place mostly during the years of the Workers' Party in government, in the federal office. So it has been common to see some voices defending that the Workers' Party was responsible for the escalation of imprisonment rates and numbers in general. And my talk here and this update of my earlier work is a way of replying to that, is a way of explaining that's not so simple to blame the presidential office, the federal executive for the increase in these numbers. And the same goes for homicide numbers, right? So here, just to make sure, you have PSDB, that's the, ironically, the Social Democratic Party, which is a neoliberal one that was in power in the 90s. And we have the Workers' Party, and we have PMDB. PMDB, it's a very tricky party, which used to be in the opposition of the dictatorship. And it was the main operator behind the overthrow of the Dilma Rousseff government. So her vice president is from this party, and he took office after her removal. And it's not clear, it's hard to actually ideologically categorize the party, because it used to be progressive in the 70s when fighting against the dictatorship. In the 80s, it began to have a more conservative agenda. And it might actually fall within the right, center-right spectrum of Brazilian politics nowadays. And then in 2019, we have Jair Bolsonaro as the new president. So for understanding this picture of Brazil, or at least in what I had done before, I think that's very important to understand these cursed legacies that have a marked imprint in the way that Brazil articulates its social control. So you have slavery, local powers, and authoritarian rule. They are not responsible for the increase in the prison population. They are not responsible for the high numbers of homicide, because they are a long-standing tradition. They are ingrained, entrenched in the social structure. But slavery is a characteristic of Brazil that still perpetuates up to nowadays. And it was the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas. It only in 1888. And when you think of the transatlantic traffic of slaves, and you think that 15 million people got into bondage in the Americas coming from Africa, we know that 5,000 of those ended up in the US, which is a very large number of people, right? But in Brazil, we had 5 million of these 15 million. So 1/3 of the slave trade from Africa ended up in bondage here in Brazil. So it's something that's very distinctive and something that's very present. The existence of slavery, besides depriving these people of the essential goods, not only throughout the years of slavery, but afterwards, there was no redress to their situation. In terms of social control, it naturalized interpersonal violence as a heritage of slavery. It gave us a cleavage in the social structure that we have up to nowadays, and it racialized our social control. The second point would be the strength of local powers. Brazil, for making sure the territory in the 19th century, right after independence, was within the administration of the empire by that time, empowered local landowners, slave owners, and created some sort of national guard in the lines of the French one, and as many continental states also did around that time. So the National Guard resorted to these private landowners to establish some small militias around the country, and they were very important in the Republic in 1889 and forward. And they bring with them, mostly in rural areas, in the most remote regions of the country, informal means of social control. So violence is privatized. And I would say that that kind of mentality spills over to other settings in Brazil as well. And then we have the periods of authoritarian rule, in which we had several times of dictatorship. We had right at the beginning of the Republic in the 1890s, we had it in 37 and 45, and the main one between 1964 and 1985, 21 years of authoritarian rule in Brazil. And during that time, mostly the last one, we had a lot of institutional abuse and violation of human rights that were concealed within the structure of governance, and that still takes place. And an approach of war on crime has been established, not only formally but informally. through the creation by the very state apparatus of death squads that have been around since the 1950s, and they are still. I don't know if you managed to see in the paper, the first 2 paragraphs is exactly talking about the situation of a massacre, and it's exactly that kind of death squads within the police operating as in a regular basis up to nowadays. So this is the cursed legacy, but over the last years, since the return of democracy, what I argue, and I believe that's the most important aspect for the high numbers of incarceration that we have in the country, at least incarceration, is the modernization of the penal state. So the penal apparatus, the criminal justice apparatus has been modernized, has been enlarged, has received a lot of funds. So we do have something that would be an expansion, which is the sheer numbers are much bigger, but we do also have the standardization of practice, the federal government attempting to make it more homogeneous around the country, the structure of criminal justice operations, mostly through the reform of the police and the prison system, and also within the territory, some attempt of establishing a more fine-grained relationship with some specific areas and topics of concern. So the creation of special courts, the creation of more territorial divisions, so which would get closer both the judicial system, but also the police to the population. We had a strong urbanization over the last years as well, and that helps a lot. That goes in tandem with this modernizing process. And my point is that this modernization process, on top of those cursed legacies, those are the ones who prompted the arrival of mass incarceration in the country. So they are actually the mechanisms that operating together give us this outlook, at least of penal policies of imprisonment here in Brazil. So for explaining this situation, the most traditional framework would be a little bit different from the one that I'm taking here, which would be a modernizing process. It's basically the punitiveness and penal populism. And I'm not exactly arguing against it. I'm just refining it and trying to understand so that these classic arguments also find echo here in Latin America, the work of Máximo and Brazil, in which we do have, it's a two-way movement, right? It's a bottom-up and a top-down type of articulation of punitive penal policies. The bottom-up would be the punitiveness that is within the social fabric, gets expression after the decline of the ideals of rehabilitation and the retrenchment of state bureaucracies, and the top-down approach would be penal populism, in which specific actors within the system, politicians, would resort to tough on crime agenda to advance their political electoral careers, right? They would manage to create a platform based on tough on crime perspectives. So we do have these two discourses going around, and we do have some works that are trying to exactly identify these pressures. And one of the points in relation to the Workers' Party is to say that they have been, while in office, lenient in relation to changes, structural changes in the criminal justice apparatus. Even if they did not endorse a more punitive perspective, they have been complacent. They have helped to create the crisis in the system that we have been facing, well, for quite some time now. But my point is that I believe that punitiveness play a part in it, but it has a lot to do with the authoritarian legacy and how this authoritarian legacy managed to infiltrate into pockets, into institutional pockets, which are quite clear in terms of the police, but which also resonate within the judicial system, within the office of the prosecutor as well. The several officers prosecutors that are around the country, the judges that are around the country, right? We have around 16,000 judges in the country. So it's also, that mentality is also ingrained there. I'm not going to be addressing some of the changes in national plans and legislation in Brazil to show that the response or the initiatives in the federal administration have been ambivalent, to say the least. But I do believe that the reasons for punitiveness to be expressed is within actors in the penal state. So they are the ones carrying that perspective forward. But we get to state dynamics. And something that's very important is disassemble that notion of the state, of a unified perspective, a unified penal policy. And when you get to see the data, I didn't get here in my presentation the rates, but the rates are there. The 2019 rates are there in the paper. You see a lot of variation in the country. And in the state where I am right now, in Bahia, we have the lowest rate. And that's one of the conundrums that I'm trying to grapple with right now. That's exactly to understand why is it taking place here in Bahia, which has one of the highest homicide rates in the country, has such a low imprisonment rate. But it varies a lot across the country. And that reminds us of many works that have been talking about that, right? West and Greenberg, Barker, that have addressed that variation, that subnational variation. And the same happens here. And the state dynamics is actually the most important. The bulk of crime control and punishment is run by state administrations. The governors are the ones who are controlling the budget, most of the budget for the criminal justice system. Not for the organization of policing, for the organization of prison establishments. The federal government, well, at the federal level, we do have a prison system, which, if I'm not mistaken, has 5 establishments so far. It's not very robust. We do have judicial system as well. We have the federal judicial system, which out of these 16,000 judges in the country might be responsible for 1,000 and something. So it's a fraction of the whole system. And the most important, policing. Though we have a federal police, its attributions are not as important as the state ones. And within the state, we have a division between police forces. We have the military one, which is in charge of patrolling, and we have the civil police force, which is supposed to be investigating crimes. So they work closer to the office of the prosecutor, to the judicial system. They provide evidence for criminal trials. But most of the policing takes place within a military format, which in a different paper, in a different argument, is important to discuss another legacy, the legacy of this colonial type of policing, a militarized approach in policing in Brazil. But both of them quite clearly have authoritarian not only pockets, but well, I would argue that institutional outlook of these forces are heavily influenced by authoritarian ideologies or approaches. And as I'm explaining here, 8% of the expenditures in policing and crime control reside within state administrations. So it's very important to actually look at the reality of these states to make sense of what's happening in Brazil. There has been some attempts to run regressions, econometrics in explaining the variation here. And the main problem behind that approach is the statistics, which are not reliable. So I was so surprised in recent years right now, like witnessing the decrease in the prison population of one state, the state of Paraná, which is the place where the famous car wash operation took place. So they were decreasing their prison population. And then, so they had at some point a peak of 51,000 inmates. And by the end of 2018, they had around 30,000, so 20,000 less people behind bars in the state. But in 2020, they jumped to 72, which is adding 43,000 people to the numbers that they had. And then the first reactions around the country were like, well, what's happening there? Well, not among a few scholars that are paying attention to it, right? They were so surprised, overblown. But then I went to the data, the broken down data, and I could just realize that while they were under the governance of PSDB, the neoliberal government, they were fiddling with the numbers as well. They did not report people in jail. So they just erased a lot of the people that were behind bars. And then at some point in 2020, they decided to bring these people back to the numbers. So some quantitative approach might get a problem overcoming these difficulties. I think that a closer inspection would be more interesting in that regard. So in terms of prison population, the dynamics here, what I would like to point to is that it might give you an idea of the rate of imprisonment. If you want to have a closer look, please refer to the paper. But what strikes me most here is the fact that São Paulo, which is this large 30% chunk here in the left, is the state that most incarcerates people. It's the wealthiest, is the most developed, is the powerhouse in Brazil, obviously. But almost one third of the prison population in Brazil is located there. And it used to be much more because the mass incarceration in the state of São Paulo took place in the 90s, when we don't have numbers broken by states. So what happens is that it only has a fifth of the population in the country and a third of the prison population, right? And other states are increasing their rates. They might be catching up. The participation in the share of São Paulo might be reducing, but mass incarceration in Brazil, and they would dare to argue that perhaps to a large extent in Latin America is a product of São Paulo. People from São Paulo normally do not acknowledge that. They talk about their system, but they do not actually indicate this large role in their prison population. And what's very important is to understand that this state has been governed by the social democratic / neoliberal party since the 90s, uninterruptedly. So they are in power there, if I'm not mistaken, since the mid-90s and up to nowadays. So mass incarceration in Brazil instead of being something that you can blame on the federal government, on the Workers' Party, it's much more of a result of criminal policies, penal policies, the articulation of the apparatus taking place in São Paulo, and as we are going to see, in some other states that have been governed by this type of coalition throughout time. What's important, or at least the periods that we are analyzing here from 2007, right? And what's important is that PSDB, it came as a derivation from PMDB, so they are closer to the arrangements in the opposition to the dictatorship. They attempted to have a social democratic approach at the beginning, but their government in the federal office, in the Brazilian government, adopted a neoliberal approach to economics, to running the country. And what's most striking is that for managing to establish a coalition in parliament, in state legislations, in government in general, they struck a compromise with the party, or at least what used to be the party that was giving support to the dictatorship throughout the 21 years of authoritarian rule. So they had that kind of neoliberal, conservative, and here in Brazil / authoritarian amalgam that might be important to have a closer look at how it played out in the administration or in the elaboration of criminal and penal policies. So I'm getting closer to my time. I actually went above it a little bit. Sorry, this presentation was 1 hour and a half long. Then I managed to cut to 1 hour, and I'm trying to wrap up within 35-40 minutes. So this moment between 2007 and 2010, it's the moment of greatest investment, federal investment. And we have the PSDB here, the neoliberal party, being responsible for the largest increase. We have the map of Brazil, right? São Paulo, I don't know if you can see my pointer here. So it's in blue. You have the state here, the state of Minas Gerais right above. That's the second largest prison population. I'm afraid that Paraná here, which is close to São Paulo as well, might have surpassed Minas Gerais. And you have in red the Workers' Party government in Bahia, which is the lowest rate of incarceration, right? It's one of the main states in the country as well. When Dilma got into office, she dismantled the politics or the policies of crime control and imprisonment that were orchestrated by the federal government. And that was the time of the World Cup and the Olympic Games, well, the preparation for the World Cup and the Olympic Games. And we have a major event, that's the demonstrations of 2013, which put the country into a turmoil, and a turmoil that we are facing up to nowadays. One more time, PSDB, which now in this moment manages to actually get state administrations all over the country. The Workers' Party is still secluded, is still in a few states. So the chunk of imprisonment is within the PSDB administration, and the largest increase as well. Then we have the overthrow of the government of Dilma Rousseff's government. It's the great political crisis and the return of the military, of the armed forces. Since 1992, we have the deployment of armed forces in operations for law and order maintenance. But in this period here, it explodes, it goes to a much higher deployment. And the most important would be the intervention in Rio de Janeiro to deal with high levels of criminality there. So the last year of the government, Temer, the vice president of Dilma, is characterized by that intervention. And then we have Minas Gerais swapping to the hands of the Workers' Party. PSDB is still in control of most of the state administrations. And then we might have a leveling out of the increase in the numbers. But exactly in this moment here, that's when Paraná, which is within the hands of PSDB, is fiddling with their numbers. So these numbers here might not actually be real for the increase in the neoliberal governance in state administrations, right? That might be actually more than what's shown by the statistics. So, and then we have the arrival of punitiveness. A good criminal is a dead one was the motto of Jair Bolsonaro in his electoral campaign. And his trajectory to power is extremely linked to the armed forces, but mostly to one specific sector of the armed forces, what I'm translating here as the underground. In Portuguese, we call porão. Those are the ones running the system of control of political dissidents in the country. They were the ones responsible for human rights violations. So Jair Bolsonaro and his affiliates, they emerge exactly out of there. They are the ones defending exactly those perspectives. And in terms of state politics, we do have a fragmentation. A lot of the state administrations was in the race, in the electoral race in 2018, they managed to actually grab or get hold of many state administrations, and it became much more fragmented. But this rhetoric of abuse and violation of human rights has been a major overtone of the campaign and of these administrations. But the numbers, once again, we have the problems of the pandemics get in the way of assessing what's taking place in relation to their implementation of policies, mostly because there was a concerted effort, a failed concerted effort to reduce the prison population by the judicial system. But so the numbers are not precise. Trying to follow that lead might be a bit problematic. So my point is, again, get to this clash in the criminal justice apparatus, understanding that in the democratic period here in Brazil, we do have this approach on the rule of law and defense of human rights. I pitched against the law and order and war on crime authoritarian rule. So we do have the demonization of human rights and its advocates of recent. And although that has been a feature of police forces throughout the whole democratic transition. And we have the return of the underground. They even managed to capture some seats in the parliament. They increased the number of representatives in the parliament over the last years and mostly in the last elections. And just to wrap up, right, what I'm trying to present for you guys here was this subnational variation, right, the existence of these different rates around the country. There's one thing that I might not have emphasized, but well, I think that I pointed to it, which is some parties are much more inclined to establish a comfortable arrangement with authoritarian forces. And I believe this is one of the key aspects for understanding tougher criminal policies and rates of imprisonment. And then we have the return of the repressed, mostly this underground perspective coming to light once again. So that's what I had for today. So thank you once again.